All right, I have the pleasure this morning of introducing, as I said, my sort of office mate, just a couple doors down, Dr. Claudia Benham, who is an environmental social scientist working on coastal and marine ecosystems and social ecological systems. Her research examines the intersection between environmental change, resource development, human well-being, and governance in coastal regions of Northern Australia and the Pacific. She was formerly at JCU, and I think actually worked here before that at GCI, Global Change Institute, as well. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Claudia.
Thanks, Daniel. I'm just going to share my screen. Before we get started with the presentation today, I just wanted to start off with the poll, mostly because even though semester's over, I can't help myself. So if you wanted to join in with this Menti poll, and the question is, which words come to mind when you think about the Great Barrier Reef? So you can join in by going to the website at the top and using the code. And I should say that I've borrowed this question and adapted it from the social and economic long-term monitoring program that's run by CSIRO in the Great Barrier Reef. So it's a question that they've asked local communities along the GBR coast on a couple of occasions over the last 10 years. Okay, so we've got a couple of responses coming in. Yeah. We'll just give it another minute to update. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting exercise to do because I think it just kind of highlights both the values of the reef. So it's values to tourism, it's values of the World Heritage Area, but also the increasing level of threats from climate change and other land uses. So that's really interesting. Thank you. I'm just going to stop this. And I should say, if anyone's interested in seeing the results as they continue to come in, feel free to let me know. I'm just going to switch my screen. Okay, hopefully you can see that. Excellent. Okay, let me know if you've got any issues hearing or seeing the slides at any time. So thanks very much, Daniel and Kate. All good? Yeah, perfect. Yeah, so thanks so much for the opportunity to speak. I joined CEAS here in CBCS last year, and it was a really strange time to kind of move jobs. And it's been quite difficult to get to know people. So when I was thinking about putting this presentation together this morning and think about what I wanted to talk to you about, ultimately there were sort of a few different topics that I could have presented, and ultimately I've decided to go for a bit of an overview of some of the research projects that I've been working on over the last few years. And then if you've got further questions or you want to have more of a discussion about any of the topics, either today or at a later date, feel free to get in touch. So the projects I'm talking about this morning all share a common theme, and that is community futures or regional community futures in the Great Barrier Reef. And so what I mean by that is that this research is really all about, as Daniel said, those interactions between environmental change and social change within regional communities along the Great Barrier Reef. And the communities that I do most of my work in are industrialised communities. So the areas surrounding port environments where those kind of potential conflicts between industrial development and the health of the reef are particularly evident. So I'll be talking about that today. And there's kind of a couple of key research questions that drive this work. One is, well, what are the impacts of climate change on community wellbeing in the Great Barrier Reef region? So trying to understand in a very broad way what those impacts are. So beyond the immediate livelihoods impacts towards people's values and mental health and broader wellbeing. And also looking forward, how can we build resilience and create regional futures that are sustainable and equitable and are also grounded in place? So part of the research is looking back and looking at current conditions and current challenges, but then also looking forward and trying to understand how we as researchers can help support communities to make those decisions about the future through creating tools to support decisions, through facilitating opportunities for communities to get together and really think the issues through. So part of what I'll be talking about is quite methodological, because a lot of this work is quite exploratory. So it's about creating new methods or bringing together different methodological approaches. So I'll be talking a little bit about that, and particularly about community deliberation as a way of potentially navigating some of the conflicts between industrial development and the future of the Great Barrier Reef. So I just wanted to touch very briefly on this question of what makes the coast different and why is it such an interesting, important area to study. I know that I'm speaking to an audience of people who probably already know this, so I won't spend too much time on it. But I think it's worth sort of thinking about the coast as this patchwork of different ecosystems, but also regulatory regimes. So the Great Barrier Reef coast spans a very large area, obviously, and it's also very complex from a regulatory perspective. So it's got multiple different agencies that are involved in making decisions, multiple different communities living along that coast. In some cases, we've got growing coastal populations and that kind of unique intersection of change in the terrestrial and marine environments. We also have a legacy effect in the Great Barrier Reef, and like any coastal ecosystem, where we have a system of past and present policies that can also, in their own way, impact on environmental outcomes or act as stresses on the coastal system themselves. So the next couple of pictures are from Matt Kernock, who works for CSIRO up in Townsville, and he's also a really accomplished photographer. And he gave me permission to use some of his images, which I just think are really fantastic. And I think they capture what we often think about when we think about the Great Barrier Reef. So the Great Barrier Reef is a tourism destination, the biodiversity values of the reef, and particularly coral reef habitats. So these are the kinds of things that many of you brought up in that poll earlier. But it's also a really interesting patchwork of other land uses and ecosystems. So my work initially, when I was sort of getting into working in the Great Barrier Reef space, was working on seagrasses. And you can see we've got just this really interesting patchwork of ecosystems. There's a lot of focus, we know, in the literature and also in the media on coral reef ecosystems, but there's a huge amount of diversity in the reef and diversity of land uses as well. And one of those land uses, of course, is port development. So you can see this is a picture from Queensland Health, and this is their map of remoteness and remote areas. So you can kind of see, once you're starting to move up the coast of the Great Barrier Reef, many of these areas are outer regional Australia, moving towards remote Australia. And I've just marked the major ports along the Great Barrier Reef here. There are a number of other ports, but these are kind of the big industrial import and in some cases also export ports for heavy industry, mining products, coal and things like that. So I think the regional or remote context is important to keep in mind. If we look at that map against the extent of the Great Barrier Reef, you can see here, oops, sorry, you can see it's a very large and diverse ecosystem. As we know, and it's extending all the way up to the top here of Cape York. So it's large, it's very complex, it's very difficult to manage. So this is one of those port developments. You can see this is the first export of LNG from Gladstone, from Curtis Island. And this is just something that I pulled from the Coordinator General's Department the other day. This is a map of the large resource projects that are currently operating in Queensland. And these are just the big resource projects that are covered by the recent legislative changes in 2017, which were kind of around making sure benefits from resource development flow to communities. But you can see really all I want to highlight from this is this clustering of mining projects, particularly coal projects along the coast, which are linked to those ports. So I think often there is a little bit of a separation between managing the environment in the Great Barrier Reef and managing some of the resource industries or social impacts. And part of what my work is trying to do is to bring those together a little bit more. So one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about the Great Barrier Reef at the moment is, of course, because you would have seen a couple of weeks ago that UNESCO, the World Heritage Committee, has indicated its intention to consider listing the Great Barrier Reef as in danger again, so to consider again doing that. And this is just an excerpt from that first report that they did in 2012 when they came out and did their monitoring mission and flagged the impacts of coastal development on the reef. And I think it's an interesting, very interesting report. And it's quite a strong indictment of management of the reef, really, in UN terms. So they've said that the scale and pace of development proposals appear beyond the capacity for independent, quality and transparent decision making. So really quite a strong statement from them about the way that the Great Barrier Reef, the prospects for the Great Barrier Reef. Okay, so if we're kind of bringing it back a little bit more to that industrial context, I just wanted to talk a little bit about what's going on at that sort of local level in industrial boom towns. And maybe the archetype of the industrial boomtown in Queensland, at least a few years ago, was Gladstone. And part of my work has been focused on looking at social and environmental impacts in Gladstone Harbour associated with that liquefied gas development. So all I want to highlight here is the shape of that boom and how pronounced and how rapid that environmental and social change is, and economic change associated with things like gas development and mining to a lesser extent, particularly gas development. It has a very sharp sort of increase in population and workers. So this is non-resident workers, fly-in, fly-out workers. You can see it's gone right up and spiked here in 2014 when the LNG plants were really at the height of construction. And then there's a couple of other ways of just looking at the shape of the boom town, I guess, in Gladstone. So on the bottom right here, you can see rental prices and the cost of housing spiking again, sort of around 2013, 2014. Whoops, sorry. And again, here up the top, you've got the smoothed unemployment rate. So right down here, this is resident unemployment. So you can kind of see there's a little bit of a difference in employment here, where it's kind of more local residents were being employed earlier in the projects, and then you've got this spike in kind of non-resident workers. But I guess my overall point is that there is there's a really pronounced and kind of typical shape of social and environmental impacts for mining development and gas development. But for gas development, it's particularly pronounced because it's a very short construction period in comparison to, say, mining that might involve multiple stages over many decades. So this is not just a case in the Great Barrier Reef. This is Darwin. This is the INPEX development in Darwin Harbour, which was built just after the Gladstone LNG developments. And you can see this graph is a little bit skew if on the x-axis, but you can kind of see that same boom. So you've got here again, population boom here sort of in 2012, 2013, and then sort of tapering off again in more recent years. And that's again associated with the construction of the LNG plant. So it's something that we see across contexts with regional industrial development, but it's particularly pronounced with LNG, and particularly the case for certain groups within the community. So it's a really interesting paper here by Andrew Taylor and Dean Carson up at CDU, Charles Darwin, about the gendered impacts. So what we see in these communities is that there are particular social groups, so low socioeconomic groups, low income earning families, families with children, families who are experiencing family and partner violence that might be under particular stress. But overall, you kind of see this pattern where there's a very large boom, and then we then see that followed quite quickly by the bust. And this is what's happened in Gladstone, as in Darwin and many other industrial communities. So I say this just to kind of set the tone for some of the historical context for industrial communities along the reef, Gladstone in particular, and to a lesser extent other communities like Townsville, where, for example, the collapse of Queensland nickel has also led to flow-on social and economic impacts since 2015. So the kind of the idea of the boomtown is sort of, it's a pattern that is really common across different contexts, but there are certain features of the coastal context that maybe make it a little bit more particular or more susceptible to social impacts or social environmental impacts because of the nature of the surrounding environment. So this is a study from the 1970s, the original boomtown. This actually came from the American West. So it was kind of this, a scholar who had sort of observed the pattern across a number of different mining communities, and basically saying that they all shared similar characteristics. So they tended to be isolated and rural. They tended to have this kind of spatial and temporal concentration of development. There tended to be problems with governance, so not enough control over land use and allocation, a lot of population growth, and that then sometimes can lead to conflicts between social groups. And increasingly over time, we've understood that there are also then conflicts between the environment and sometimes community values or aspirations. But the coastal context of development in the Great Barrier Reef is what's unique. So it shares a lot of characteristics with other similar forms of development across the world. But the place-based elements are what makes it different, and they're the things that I want to talk about today. So just summarising, there are some particular characteristics of liquefied natural gas development that set it apart from, say, conventional mining or inland developments. And part of that is that short construction boom. So in comparison to, say, a mine, LNG terminals are built very fast, usually sort of maybe 5 years approximately. And in that time, there's a very large workforce employed. So in Gladstone, there was a lot of recruitment. There were about approximately 15,000 people employed at the height of construction. And then once those projects are operational, there are about 500 people being employed. So it's a very fast, compressed kind of boom and bust cycle. And of course, then there are those highly specific environmental impacts associated with dredging, associated with construction of those terminals in the coastal environment. So if you're not familiar with the context of Gladstone, there are 3 LNG terminals. They're processing and exporting coal seam gas, which is transported from about 450 kilometres inland. So it's processed, it's loaded onto tankers and exported. And as part of that process, to accommodate those deeper draft ships in Gladstone Harbour, there was quite an extensive capital dredging program that's undertaken. And also the impacts of having increased shipping movements, and yeah, particularly impacts on those coastal environments. So impacts on seagrasses, impacts on mangroves associated with clearing those areas to develop that infrastructure, so mooring and shipping areas. So as I touched on, we've got a number of kind of social impacts, particularly among low income earners. So there was a period in Gladstone where a lot of people came in looking for accommodation. There wasn't enough accommodation available. A number of people were having to sleep in the showground in tents. It's like a tent city. And low income earners are the people who were unable to find work in the industry, or they weren't able to afford to continue living in the region. They moved out of the region. In some cases, people, retirees in particular, moved out, sometimes because they couldn't afford to keep living there, and sometimes because they sold their houses at the height of the boom and they moved elsewhere because there were retirement facilities further down the coast, and they wanted to take advantage of those. But one of the impacts of that is that the community lost access to free childcare, and there was a real pressure on paid childcare services. There were also impacts on women, particularly women who are in a domestic violence situation. They were unable to find alternative housing. So what I wanted to highlight here is that there's a number of flow-on impacts that are not captured in social impact assessment. So we don't do a very good job at capturing those secondary and tertiary impacts. And what we can really only understand what they are through doing qualitative work after the project's already started. And that creates a bit of a conflict with the way that the projects are governed at the moment, and the kind of environmental impact process, which I'll talk a little bit about in a minute, which really is focused on understanding impacts before the project actually starts. So it's difficult then for decision makers to understand and to be able to capture some of those later social impacts, or things that arise through the interaction of environmental and social and economic changes as the project goes through the construction phase and then into operation. Also a number of impacts on recreational users and other users of the harbour. So perceptions that safety had really declined, and of course also the loss of important habitat. So there was a bit of a confluence of different environmental changes and threats around about 2011, 2012. There was flooding, major flooding event in the region at the same time as the dredging campaign was happening, and there was quite significant impacts on coastal ecosystems, particularly seagrasses, and as a result, impacts on dugongs, key commercial and recreational fishery species, and also marine turtles. So there was, and those impacts were really quite apparent to the local community. So a whole range of impacts, and particularly impacts that are quite difficult to note, or that weren't predicted before the developments actually started. So one of the ways that I find really useful to think about these developments or impacts together is this idea of an impact geography. And partly that's my bias as a human geographer, but I find it really, really useful. So it's quite a new concept. It was developed by some researchers in the US that are looking at the American West and the Midwest developments, so the big shale gas developments in the northern United States. And they developed this idea, which is really just kind of a way of describing that constellation of social and environmental impacts and the impact that development has on place. So I find it a really useful concept, and I just wanted to mention it today because I think it's quite useful to draw from different disciplines. So this is a concept that came out of a very different kind of, I guess, rural sociology background. different from my discipline, but it's a very useful concept in human geography. Okay. All right. Oops. Okay, so the reason that I bring that up is because a lot of the work that I do and others are doing in the Great Barrier Reef is around place and the idea of change in important ecosystems and habitats. So communities that are living along the Great Barrier Reef, and all of us really understand the cultural and social value of the Great Barrier Reef. So it's an iconic ecosystem. It's highly valued among local communities, but also among really anybody living in Queensland, living in Australia. Those kind of environmental values, it's very cross-cutting. So some of the work some of this work in Gladstone was survey-based work that asked local communities about the values that they associated with the marine environment, and across the political spectrum, across people who would describe themselves as very green, and people who were very pro-development and pro-industry. Everybody values the Great Barrier Reef. I think it was like 98% of people said that they really value the Great Barrier Reef. And so it's a cross-cutting issue and a value that is important at that community level. So even though we've got lots of a range of different impacts going on within the local community, one of the issues that unites people is this, the valuing and the desire to protect the Great Barrier Reef. And over the next part of the presentation, I just want to dig into that a little bit more, because one of the things that I identified through working in Gladstone was this idea of ecological grief and loss that is associated with changing environments. And so I kind of fell into this area a little bit, the area of ecological grief, because this is what the community was telling me. So I had been doing work in Gladstone for a few years. I was living up there, and I did some whole lot of interview work as well as surveys. And this idea of ecological grief just kept coming up, and it was something that the community was saying. So people would actually come and raise with me. They would use that word of grief. And so I did some further work on that and starting to unpack a little bit of the impacts on place. And in the subsequent years, this concept has really started to, I think, resonate more broadly. And there's been a lot more work that's been done in Canada in particular, and in Western Australia, that has picked up on that same issue. So I want to spend a little bit of time on it, because I think it's a concept that is gaining increasing currency, unfortunately, as we see the increasing change in the environment. So what's really apparent in Gladstone is that communities are experiencing what they describe as a grief response, which is associated with the loss of important habitats. And so that work in Gladstone is particularly around environmental change associated with industrial development, so direct impacts of industry, construction of new gas plants, dredging, and those immediate impacts. But now what we're seeing, as we have an increasing number of coral bleaching events occurring in summer over the last few years, is that there is a broader expression of ecological loss or grief within the reef itself. So, and this is, I guess, as I said, consistent with other research that has been emerging from very different contexts. So Northern Canada, the Australian wheat belt in Western Australia. It's remarkably similar. The story is remarkably similar across those different contexts. But I think there are some particular characteristics of the reef that are worth talking about. So I wanted to talk a little bit about those a couple of papers recently from the Great Barrier Reef context, and then sort of flesh this issue out a little bit more. So what's increasingly apparent is that perceptions of ecological grief and loss in the Great Barrier Reef are really linked to place. So whether that's an industrial place or a place that we might think of as a little bit more pristine, local communities are very often express very strong attachments and values to local environments. And so that was one of the things that we wanted to pick up on in this paper here at the bottom, Brief Grief, which was a paper led by Nadine Marshall. And so we used the data from publicly available data from the Social and Economic Long-Term Monitoring Program, which surveys thousands of local residents, in this case, 1,870 local residents, tourists, fishers, commercial fishers and tourism operators, and collates that data. And that survey is running at the moment, and it's run on two occasions in the past. There's a data set from 2013, 2017, and now 2021. And in the 2017 survey, one of the questions that was asked was, how do you respond to the statement, when I think about coral bleaching, I feel depressed? And the really striking finding with that was that over half of residents, tourists and tourist operators, and almost a quarter of fishers reported significant reef grief. So they agree or strongly agreed with that statement. And I think it's really, for me, looking at that data, it's quite personally impactful, because it's suggesting that the impacts of climate change are really extending beyond what we might typically think about, like livelihood impacts, and starting to affect people's mental health. And of course, it's not just something that's limited to local communities. I think we all know and feel to some degree this feeling of environmental loss if we're working in the environmental space. And this was I know that a number of people at CBCS have shared articles about this just in the last month or two. And this was an article from Nature, which is talking about scientists who are working on the reef and that feeling of ecological grief. There are various kind of ways of thinking about environmental loss and ecological grief. In Australia, we tend to sort of think about the idea of solastalgia, which is a really interesting term that was coined by Glenn Albrecht and a number of other researchers looking at mining towns. And it's trying to capture this same idea of the distress that is associated with the loss of important environments. So it's a concept that seems to transcend context in some ways. So I can see that I'm kind of almost at the half-hour mark. What I wanted to do very briefly is to sort of talk about how we might actually start to address some of these things. I think as a researcher and just somebody who's looking at the news about environmental change, you know, it can feel incredibly overwhelming. And I think there's a little bit of a disjunct in the way that, maybe saying a little bit is an understatement, but there's a disjunct between governance and social well-being and environmental outcomes that really needs to be addressed. So my work really is looking at the environmental impact assessment process and how that is linked to community outcomes. And there's a lot to kind of unpack in that, but I just wanted to speak to this idea of community deliberation, because I think for me, it's probably the most hopeful avenue for making change that I have seen in my work. And I'd love to know if there are other things that make you feel hopeful, or techniques that you think could be really useful in kind of charting a better future. I think community deliberation has a lot of potential. So I'm going to move through this quite quickly, but I just wanted to highlight the types of engagement that are already out there. So when I say engagement, I mean, how does the government, or how do companies go out and talk to local communities and find out what they actually want? So in most cases, this is what they do. They do an information stall, or they do a Q&A session, or they do a public meeting sometimes. And a lot of the time it's kind of, it's kind of a one-way or limited two-way exchange of information. And you can see here, if we just kind of move forward quite quickly, a lot of these processes are sort of up this end of this scale, where they're either giving people information or they're providing an opportunity to consult on a document or a draft impact statement. But in a lot of cases, they're quite far away from what we might think of as community-based empowered decision-making. So what deliberative democracy does is try to kind of remedy that or provide an alternative way of making decisions. So often we have these two polar opposites of decision-making. So we've got expert-led decision-making here, and you can see on the left-hand side, it's a picture of the government at the time and discussing the crisis over national gas prices, 2017. And on the right-hand side, you can see a picture from a community meeting in Gladstone. So it's really one or the other. And what deliberative democracy says as well, is it possible to kind of have a middle ground where you have community members that essentially can develop expertise in those issues through engaging in a reflexive way with other people. So I like this kind of quote here from Colorado State, where they say deliberation is an approach to politics in which citizens, not just experts or politicians, are deeply involved in community problem solving and public decision making. So one of the things that potentially that makes deliberation different from a normal kind of community meeting is the level of reflexivity and the demands that it places on participants to think about community values rather than their own values. So it's kind of a particular type of process. It's something that's come out of the theoretical political sciences, and it's been trialled in a number of different settings, including in North Queensland, but it hasn't really, it's still kind of in that sort of space where it's been translated from theory into practice. So this is an example of the Bloomfield Track. This is the first deliberative community process that happened in North Queensland, and it was about the sealing of the Bloomfield Track. It was done in the mid-2000s, around 2005, and was led by Simon Niemeyer at the University of Canberra. And it was looking at, it was really quite interesting. So when I first saw the outcomes of this, this work, I thought, oh wow, how fantastic, because what it showed was that people who had polar opposite opinions were able to come together. So people who said, no, we definitely should, the track should never be sealed, we should really minimise the amount of tourism and access to the Cape. So very, very strongly pro-conservation. There were other people who said, no, look, we need to seal it, we need to promote tourism and local development. Again, a kind of a microcosm of those polarised opinions over development and conservation. They were actually able to come together over the course of that process, which took about a week. It took a lot of site visits, it took a lot of discussion, but the outcomes were really quite extraordinary. So that's one of the processes that I've been trying to replicate in my work, and working also with Simon, who did that initial work, and with the colleagues mainly at James Cook University, to kind of look at those as regional futures. So I'm conscious that I'm sort of running out of time a little bit. So I'm going to just skip through a couple of slides and go towards the end, because I want to focus on some of the newer work just in the last couple of years, which is this, the Townsville Citizens Forum. So this was some work by myself, Simon Niemeyer, and also Stephanie Deuce, who is a spatial scientist at JCU. And it's a way of testing out a form of community deliberation. So Townsville, as you probably know, is quite it's a really interesting place. It's quite industrialized in a lot of ways. It's got a big port, but it's also a really major population centre and a big jumping off point for the reef, not so much for tourism, but there's a big push to become like a centre for education for the reef. And it's very much an area where outdoor lifestyles and access to the reef is important. So as a team, we wanted to trial out this idea of public deliberation. So there's kind of looking at trying to reconcile, well, what do we want to do with industrial futures or social economic futures in Townsville, and how do we reconcile that with protecting the reef? And what we're trying to get to here is a bit more of an empowered approach to visioning what the future might look like in reef communities. So it was a public deliberation process. We had a facilitator who was very experienced, and we had a small group of people selected at random. So we just sent out mailing invitations to a random sample of community members within Townsville. We had a small group of people respond. We had 9 participants, and we asked them to fill in some attitudinal surveys before, during, and after the workshop to kind of track whether it had an impact on their views as we move through. So one of the things that's really important with deliberation, or one of the things that you want to see, is this change in people's views after they've listened to the arguments and the suggestions of others. We also integrated that with participatory mapping to understand what people's values were about the reef and the local region. And this was actually quite interesting because we haven't previously, there is no previous example of community-based deliberation specifically using participatory mapping. So it's kind of a way of trying new methods. So I'll just kind of move through this quite quickly, but essentially what we ended up with was some really interesting mapping showing the different places that people use and value. And we use that as an entry point into having a discussion about the different ecosystems. It was really fascinating to hear people's reflections. So we had a panel of experts, which were drawn from a range of different scientific disciplines, as well as from different industries like ports, conservation, speak to people, speak to the citizens, group of citizens. And we also asked the participants, so the local residents, to engage in this mapping process and to tell us what they valued and how that changed over the course of the process. So you can see that there's a bit of a clustering of values around the coast and particular sites. And one of the things that I really like about the participatory mapping is that it elicits a lot of personal stories. It provides a jumping off point to discuss people's values in a way that is really relevant to them. And they can tell you about, like, oh, that's where I went out, that's where I got engaged, or that's where I take my kids camping every year, or that's where we go on the weekend, and things like that. So it can be quite useful. The other thing that it really highlighted for me is that can be quite difficult for communities or people in the community who don't use the marine environment much to identify those habitats and those ecosystems. So there were a lot of places where we mapped important fishing areas where people said, oh, I've been fishing for 30 years, but I didn't realize it was a seagrass bed. Because it's kind of difficult to know. I think sometimes we take for granted that ability to interpret the landscape and to know which habitats are there. But nevertheless, a lot of areas that were very highly valued. You can see that most people here are using the environment for recreation, less so for other values. And that most habitats are really clustered around the coast. And this is consistent with other research in community-based research in the reef that kind of demonstrates that even though people value these ecosystems, they're not using them very much. It can be quite difficult to actually access them sometimes, and there are some barriers to people actually getting out and using those ecosystems. So for us as researchers, I think one of the takeaways from that is that the governance, I think we probably all know this really, the governance of these ecosystems is quite difficult because we can't actually see them very easily. Most people in the local community are never actually going out to see the reef. They don't go diving, they don't go snorkeling. We actually offered, as part of the incentive for this workshop, we offered people the chance to take a trip out there. And most people declined, either because they couldn't swim or they felt nervous about going out and doing that. So we ended up taking them to the aquarium instead. And we still had a really good discussion and a look at those ecosystems in different contexts. But it was really interesting to kind of understand a little bit more about that. So you can see here that coral reefs were the most important ecosystem, followed by those coastal ecosystems and at the bottom creeks and rivers. But as we went through the process, the importance of creeks and the connectivity between those catchments and the reef became more apparent. I'm just going to skip through this, but I just want to highlight something on this slide. So we've got here at the very bottom, this category here. These are about people's priorities for the local region. And you can see here a little bit of change as we moved through the process. So the numbers here are less important than kind of the proportion. But you can see that protecting the local environment was always a really key priority for people, but it became even more pronounced as we moved through the process. So you can kind of see that even in the space of a few days, this was only a 3-day process, people's views changed and they became more strongly committed to conservation or environmental goals. So for me, I think that's really encouraging and really interesting and quite empowering for local communities, but also for us as researchers when we're thinking about, you know, what are the prospects for reconciling these conflicts between development and conservation that I sometimes feel seem quite intractable. Okay, so just a couple of concluding reflections. It's quite a big presentation, and I've touched on a lot of different areas and didn't have time to really go into everything. But what I wanted to highlight and what I'm pursuing in my current research is that we know that as the Great Barrier Reef changes, communities who are living in that area are experiencing those impacts of environmental change on their well-being and mental health. As we speak, it's already happening. And it's becoming appears to be increasingly apparent. When that first piece of work was done in 2016, it didn't seem to be particularly widespread. There wasn't a lot of media discourse around it, but by 2018, 2019, after the earliest coral bleaching events, it started to become really apparent. There was a lot of discussion about it in local communities and discussion in the media and public discourse more generally. So I think participation, community deliberation is a really powerful way of engaging with communities. It's very different to what already happens in communities most of the time. So there's a big gap between the way that decisions are currently made and the way that things could be done. And of course, deliberation is not a silver bullet. It's a very potentially quite expensive and resource intensive activity to do. But I think it has some really useful prospects and applications. And I think, yeah, all I wanted to say really is that there's so much that we don't know about this area. A lot of the work is very exploratory. But I think there are so many different areas for future research. So if there is interest in this area, I'd really welcome any discussions. All right, thanks very much.